This story is based on real events. Names, locations, and details were changed to protect the identity and privacy of the families involved. The night had settled over Willow Creek like a held breath, too quiet for late summer. Crickets had gone silent, and even the wind seemed hesitant as headlights crawled up the dirt road toward the Langford Ranch. Inside, Emily Langford shifted restlessly in bed, her hand on the swell of her pregnant belly, the other clutching her phone, waiting for a husband who had promised to return hours ago. Daniel Langford, the man every neighbor called the heart of the heartland, had vanished into the night, leaving only the heavy scent of sweat in the air around the barn. Outside, Daniel leaned against the barn doors, a cigarette trembling between his fingers, the sweat of labor and tension clinging to him. Beside him stood the drifter, Eli, a young man with soft hands and eyes that dared too much, a presence that Daniel had not anticipated, one that stirred a hunger he had long buried beneath his reputation, his hard work, and his family's trust. To everyone in town, Daniel Langford was a legend, a self-made rancher whose word was law, whose hands built prosperity from dust, whose smile carried charm and authority. Inside his home, Emily had believed in him without question, but now in the silence of the barn, that trust teetered on the edge of a secret that could shatter every foundation of their golden life. 3 weeks earlier, Eli Morrison had walked into Willow Creek with nothing but a duffel bag and a story about needing work. He was 23, lean and sun-browned, with dark curls that fell into eyes the color of storm clouds. When he'd shown up at the Langford Ranch asking for day labor, Daniel had hesitated only a moment before hiring him. "We could use the extra hands for harvest," Daniel had told Emily that evening, his voice casual as he carved into his steak. "Kid seems capable enough." Emily had smiled, trusting as always. "You've always had good instincts about people." But Daniel's instincts had been anything but clear. From the first day Eli worked the field, something shifted in the air between them. It was in the way Eli looked at him. Direct, unflinching, like he could see through the armor of respectability Daniel had spent decades building. It was in the lingering moments when their hands brushed passing tools, in the way Eli's laugh carried across the fields like a challenge. Daniel told himself it meant nothing. He was a married man, a pillar of the community, a father-to-be. He had built his entire life on discipline and control, but control, he was discovering, had limits. The workdays grew longer as autumn approached. Daniel found excuses to keep Eli late, fence repairs that could wait, equipment that didn't really need fixing. Emily, swollen with pregnancy and exhausted, went to bed earlier each night, leaving Daniel alone with the young man who had begun to occupy far too much space in his thoughts. They talked during those late hours, sitting on hay bales in the barn while the ranch settled into darkness around them. Eli spoke of cities Daniel had never seen, of a life lived without roots or responsibility. He was everything Daniel was not: free, reckless, unburdened by expectation. "Don't you ever want to just leave?" Eli asked one night, his voice low in the intimate darkness. "Start over somewhere nobody knows your name?" Daniel had laughed, but it came out hollow. "I have a life here, a wife, a baby coming." "That's not what I asked." Eli's eyes caught the dim light from the single bulb overhead. "I asked what you want." The question hung between them like smoke, dangerous and intoxicating. Daniel stood abruptly. "It's late. You should head back to the bunkhouse." But as Eli passed him in the narrow space between stalls, their shoulders brushed. Eli paused, turned his head just slightly. For 3 heartbeats, neither man moved. Then Daniel stepped back, his jaw tight. "Good night, Eli." Eli smiled, slow, knowing. "Good night, boss." Emily noticed the changes first. Daniel grew distant, distracted. He came to bed smelling of cigarettes he'd sworn he'd quit years ago. He forgot conversations they'd had, missed appointments for the baby. When she reached for him in the night, he turned away, claiming exhaustion. "Is everything all right with the ranch?" she asked one morning, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea, watching him avoid her gaze. "Fine. Just busy." His voice was clipped, defensive. "And the new worker? Eli? Is he working out?" Something flickered across Daniel's face, too quick to name, too telling to miss. "He's fine. Good worker." But Emily had been married to Daniel Langford for 6 years. She knew the difference between truth and evasion. Still, she wanted to believe. She needed to believe. So she pushed the doubt down deep, and told herself it was pregnancy hormones making her paranoid. The town noticed too, though they spoke in whispers. Margaret from the general store mentioned to her sister that Daniel Langford had been seen driving the young drifter into town more than necessary. Pastor Williams commented to his wife that Daniel had missed 2 church services in a row, unprecedented for a man who'd served as deacon for 5 years. Maybe it's stress about the baby, people said, wanting to believe the best of their golden son. But doubt, once planted, grows like weeds. It happened on a Thursday night, humid and restless. Emily had gone to her sister's house in the neighboring town for a baby shower, planning to stay overnight. Daniel had encouraged her to go, insisted she needed the break, promised he'd be fine managing the ranch alone. The moment her taillights disappeared down the road, Daniel felt it, the terrible, thrilling freedom of an empty house. He found Eli in the barn, stripped to the waist, moving hay bales in the golden light of sunset. Sweat gleamed on his skin, and when he looked up at Daniel's approach, there was no surprise in his eyes, only expectation. "Emily's gone for the night," Daniel said, and hated how his voice sounded, rough with wanting. Eli straightened, wiping his hands on his jeans. "I know. You know? You told me yesterday. Said I should plan on working late tonight." Eli took a step closer. Said there were things that needed attention. Daniel's heart hammered against his ribs. This was the moment. The cliff's edge. He could turn around, go back to the house, pretend this conversation had never happened. Instead, he stayed rooted to the spot as Eli closed the distance between them. "Tell me to leave," Eli said softly, "and I'll go." Daniel opened his mouth. The words should have been simple, but they died on his tongue as Eli's hand found his shoulder, warm and solid and real. What happened next was inevitable. A dam breaking, years of denial crashing down in a moment of weakness and want. They fell together against the barn wall, all gasping breaths and desperate hands, the scent of hay and sweat and sin thick in the air. Shirts were pulled off, tossed carelessly aside. Daniel's wedding ring caught the fading sunlight as his fingers tangled in Eli's hair. Somewhere in the rational part of his mind, Daniel knew this was destruction. But destruction, in that moment, felt like the only honest thing he'd ever done. They didn't hear the truck returning up the driveway. They didn't see the headlights cutting through the barn's gaps. They didn't know that Emily Langford, having forgotten her prenatal vitamins, had turned around and come home. Emily's hands shook as she killed the engine. Something was wrong. She could feel it in her bones, in the unnatural silence of the ranch, in the light spilling from the barn where Daniel never left the doors open at night. She should have called out, should have announced herself. But instinct made her quiet as she approached, her pregnant belly making her movements slow and careful. The barn door was ajar, just enough. What she saw through that gap would replay in her mind for the rest of her life, frame by frame, a nightmare she couldn't escape. Daniel and Eli, shirtless, sweat-slicked, pressed together in the shadows near the far stall, Eli's back against the wooden post, Daniel's hand braced beside his head. Their faces close, too close, breath mingling in the dusty air. The intimate positioning of their bodies told a story no words could explain away. For a moment, Emily couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't process what her eyes were showing her. This wasn't her husband. This couldn't be her life. Then Daniel turned his head, some sixth sense alerting him, and his eyes locked with hers through the gap in the door. The color drained from his face. Time crystallized, fractured, shattered. "Emily." The word came out strangled, desperate. She stumbled backward, one hand flying to her mouth, the other clutching her belly as if to shield the baby from the truth of what its father was. Wait." Daniel was moving now, grabbing his shirt, his movements frantic and clumsy. But Emily was already running, as much as a pregnant woman could run, back to her truck, keys jingling wildly in her shaking hands. "Emily." Daniel's voice cracked across the night air. She slammed the truck door and gunned the engine, gravel spraying as she tore down the driveway. In the rearview mirror, she saw Daniel standing in the barn doorway, half-dressed and backlit, the physical embodiment of betrayal. Beside him, barely visible in the shadows, stood Eli. The image burned itself into her retinas. Emily drove blind with tears, muscle memory alone guiding her truck down roads she'd traveled 1,000 times. She ended up at her sister Linda's house on the edge of town, collapsing in her arms on the front porch, sobbing so hard she couldn't speak. Linda, 5 years older and protective as a lioness, didn't need the full explanation. One look at Emily's face told her enough. "I'm calling Sheriff Morrison," Linda said, her voice hard. "No." Emily grabbed her arm. "Not yet. I need to understand. I need to hear him say it." But understanding, she would learn, was the one thing Daniel Langford could not give her. He arrived 20 minutes later, still pulling on a clean shirt, his face pale and wild. Linda met him at the door with the fury of a protective sister. "You've got 5 minutes, Daniel. Then I'm throwing you out and calling every lawyer in the state." Daniel barely heard her. His eyes found Emily sitting on the couch, wrapped in a blanket despite the summer heat, her face blotchy and destroyed. "Baby, please, don't." Emily's voice was barely a whisper, but it cut like a blade. "Don't you dare call me that." Daniel sank to his knees in front of her, and the sight of him, this man she'd worshipped, this pillar of strength reduced to begging, made her stomach turn. "It was a mistake," he started, the words rehearsed and hollow. "I don't know what happened. I wasn't thinking." "How long?" Emily's eyes lifted to his, red-rimmed and merciless. "What? How long have you been with him?" Daniel's throat worked. How long?" The scream tore from her throat, raw and animal. "How long have you been sleeping with him while I carried your child? While I trusted you? While I believed in us?" 3 weeks, he whispered, the confession falling like stones. "Since he arrived." The number hung in the air. 21 days of lies, of coming home to her bed with the scent of another on his skin, of kissing her good morning with a mouth that had tasted betrayal. Emily's hand moved before thought, the crack of palm against cheek echoing through the small living room. Daniel didn't flinch, didn't move, took the blow like penance. "Get out," Emily said, her voice dead now, empty. "Get out and don't come back." "Emily, please, we can fix this." "Fix this?" She laughed, high and broken. "You destroyed us, Daniel. You destroyed our marriage, our family, our baby's future. For what? For him? For someone you barely know? I love you. You don't know what love is." Emily stood, her hand protectively over her belly. "Love doesn't hide. Love doesn't lie. Love doesn't make you feel like a fool in front of the entire town." Daniel's face crumpled. "The town doesn't know. The town will know," Linda said from the doorway, her voice cold as winter. "By morning everyone will know what you are." The threat landed like a physical blow. Daniel Langford, whose reputation was everything, whose standing in the community was his identity, felt the foundation of his entire life crack beneath him. "Please," he whispered one last time, looking at Emily with desperate eyes. "Please don't do this." Emily turned her back on him, on 6 years of marriage, on every promise they'd ever made. "You already did." Linda kept her promise. By dawn, the truth had spread through Willow Creek like wildfire through dry grass. It started with a phone call to Margaret at the general store, the town's most reliable source of gossip. Then Pastor Williams. Then Diane Hutchins, who ran the weekly newspaper. Within hours, every coffee shop, barber shop, and front porch in town buzzed with the scandal. Daniel Langford, golden boy, respected rancher, moral authority, caught with another man in his own barn while his pregnant wife slept alone. The details grew with each retelling. Some said Emily had caught them kissing. Others claimed worse. A few defenders tried to suggest it was a misunderstanding, but the defensive whispers were drowned by the roar of judgment. By mid-morning, Daniel's phone was flooded with calls he couldn't answer and messages he couldn't bear to read. His church asked him to step down from the deacon board. The Cattlemen's Association sent a terse email about reviewing his membership. Even his own ranch hands, men he'd employed for years, began requesting transfers or quitting outright. The rejection was total, absolute, unforgiving. And Eli Morrison vanished before sunrise, taking his duffel bag and leaving nothing but a note on the bunkhouse bed. "I'm sorry it ended this way, but you knew it would." Daniel walked through his ranch like a ghost, alone in the vast house that had once been filled with Emily's laughter and her dreams for their future. Every room echoed with her absence. The nursery they'd been painting together stood half-finished, a monument to what would never be. He tried to work, tried to maintain the routines that had always grounded him, but the cattle watched him with suspicious eyes, and the land itself seemed to reject him, turning stubborn and hostile under his care. The town made sure he felt their judgment. When he drove into Willow Creek for supplies, conversations stopped. People crossed the street to avoid him. Children, taught by their parents that Daniel Langford was not someone to respect anymore, pointed and whispered. At the hardware store, old Tom Brennan, who'd known Daniel since he was a boy, wouldn't meet his eyes as he rang up his purchase. "Tom," Daniel said quietly, desperate for even a moment of human connection. "I know what people are saying. I don't want to hear it, Daniel." Tom's voice was flat, final. "What you did to Emily. There's no excuse for that. Not in my book." Daniel left without his change, driving home in a fog of shame and isolation. His mother called once. Only once. "How could you?" She wept into the phone. "How could you throw away everything we raised you to be? Mom, please, don't. Don't try to explain it to me. I don't want to hear about your confusion or your mistakes. That girl loved you. She's carrying your child. And you humiliated her. You humiliated all of us." The line went dead. Daniel stared at the phone in his hand, feeling the walls of his perfect life collapsing inward, crushing him beneath the weight of his choices. While Daniel drowned in isolation, Emily began the painful work of rebuilding. She moved into Linda's house temporarily, then found a small apartment on the other side of town, far enough from the ranch that she didn't have to see it, close enough to her support network that she wasn't alone. The community that had turned on Daniel rallied around Emily. Casseroles appeared on her doorstep. Women from church organized a new baby shower. Her doctor offered to adjust his rates. The town, in its judgment of Daniel, poured its compassion into the woman he'd wronged. But Emily didn't want pity. She wanted justice. She hired the best divorce lawyer in the county, a sharp-eyed woman named Patricia Chen who specialized in taking powerful men apart piece by piece. "I want everything," Emily told her in their first meeting, her voice steady despite the tears that still came too easily. "The house, the ranch, full custody. He doesn't get to destroy me and keep his empire." Patricia smiled. "That can be arranged." The divorce papers were served to Daniel on a Tuesday morning by a stone-faced sheriff's deputy who'd once called him friend. Daniel stared at the documents, at the list of demands, at the formal dissolution of everything he'd built with Emily. She was asking for sole ownership of the ranch, the land that had been in his family for 3 generations. She wanted the house, the equipment, the livestock, the bank accounts, everything except the debt, which she graciously left for him to shoulder alone. It was financial destruction, complete annihilation, and Daniel knew he had no grounds to fight it, not after what he'd done, not with the entire town as witnesses to his shame. 6 weeks after that devastating night in the barn, Daniel sat in a conference room across from Emily for the last time. She'd gotten bigger, her belly prominent now, their child growing inside her despite the broken family it would be born into. She looked tired but resolute, her sister Linda beside her like a warrior guard, Patricia Chen on her other side with papers and pens at the ready. Daniel's lawyer, a young man from 2 towns over who'd taken the case only because no one local would, sat beside him in uncomfortable silence. Emily wouldn't look at him. For the entire hour-long meeting, she kept her eyes on the documents, on the lawyer, on anything but the man she'd once loved with her whole heart. "Mr. Langford," Patricia began, her voice professional and cold, "my client is willing to settle without a trial on the following conditions." The list was brutal. Daniel would sign over the ranch, the house, and 70% of their combined assets. He would pay child support, but would have only supervised visitation rights until the child turned 5, at which point custody would be reevaluated. He would leave Willow Creek and not return, except for designated visitation weekends. He would make no attempt to contact Emily outside of legal channels. In exchange, Emily would not pursue criminal charges for emotional distress or sue for additional damages. It was exile, complete and total. Daniel's lawyer leaned in to whisper, "We can fight this, it's excessive." "No." Daniel's voice was hollow. "Give her what she wants. Daniel, give her everything." He finally lifted his eyes to Emily, who still wouldn't look at him. "She deserves it. After what I did, she deserves everything." The lawyer sighed and began preparing the papers. As they signed document after document, Daniel tried one last time. Emily, please, look at me. Just once." Her pen paused. For a heartbeat, he thought she might turn, might give him one last glimpse of the woman he'd loved, the woman he'd destroyed. But Emily Langford was stronger than that. She finished her signature, set down the pen, and stood with Linda's help. "We're done here," she said to Patricia, and walked out of the room without a backward glance. Daniel sat alone at the conference table long after everyone else had left, staring at the papers that had just ended his life as he'd known it. Daniel spent his final night at the ranch walking the property he was about to lose. The moon was full, casting silver across the fields his grandfather had cleared, the barn his father had built, the house where he'd brought Emily as a bride. Every fence post held a memory. Every pasture told a story. This land was in his blood, part of his identity in ways he'd never had to articulate because he'd never imagined losing it. But he had lost it. Through his own weakness, his own selfishness, his own inability to be the man everyone believed he was. He ended up in the barn, the scene of his crime, and sank onto a hay bale, head in his hands. This was where it had all fallen apart. This was where he'd traded everything for a moment of feeling alive, feeling seen, feeling free from the crushing weight of being Daniel Langford, perfect son of Willow Creek. But freedom, he understood now, had cost him everything that mattered. His phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "I saw the divorce news. I'm sorry, man. For what it's worth, I didn't mean for any of this to happen. E." Daniel stared at the message from Eli, wherever he'd landed, whatever new life he'd moved on to, and felt nothing. Not anger, not longing, not even regret about the affair itself. Only the crushing weight of consequences. He didn't respond. There was nothing to say. Eli had been a symptom, not the disease. The rot had been inside Daniel all along. The doubt, the restlessness, the secret knowledge that he was living a life that didn't quite fit. But instead of being honest, instead of being brave enough to face those truths before making promises he couldn't keep, he'd buried them, built a life on a foundation of lies, married a woman he loved but wasn't fully honest with, created a child who would grow up with a father defined by shame. The barn door creaked open behind him. Daniel's heart leaped. For one irrational moment he thought it might be Emily, coming to tell him she'd changed her mind, that they could find a way through this. But it was Linda, her face hard in the moonlight. "What are you doing here?" Daniel asked wearily. "Making sure you leave tomorrow like you're supposed to." She crossed her arms. "Emily asked me to check. She's afraid you'll try to stay. Try to fight." "I'm not fighting anything." Daniel gestured at the empty barn. "It's all hers. All of it." Linda studied him for a long moment, and something in her expression shifted. Not to sympathy, but to something closer to pity. "You know what the worst part is?" she said quietly. "You didn't just betray Emily. You betrayed yourself. You built this whole life pretending to be something you're not, and when the truth came out, everyone got hurt." "I know." "Do you?" Linda took a step closer. "Because from where I'm standing, you still look like a man who thinks he's the victim in all this. Poor Daniel, caught in a moment of weakness. Poor Daniel, losing everything. That's not... My sister is 28 years old, 7 months pregnant, and filing for divorce from a man she thought was her forever. She cries herself to sleep every night. She has nightmares about that barn. She can't even drive past this property without having a panic attack." Linda's voice cracked. "So don't you dare sit here feeling sorry for yourself. You don't get to be the wounded party." The words hit like physical blows, each one landing with the weight of truth. "What do you want me to say?" Daniel whispered. "I know what I did. I know what I am. I live with it every second of every day." "Good." Linda turned toward the door, then paused. "For what it's worth, I hope you figure out who you really are someday. I hope you find a way to be honest about it. But you do that somewhere else with someone who isn't my sister. You do that without destroying innocent people." She left him there in the barn, alone with his ghosts and his regrets. Daniel sat until dawn began to break over the eastern fields. Then he walked back to the house one last time, packed a single bag, and loaded his truck with the few possessions Emily had permitted him to keep. At 7 a.m., he pulled out of the driveway of the Langford Ranch for the last time. In the rearview mirror, he watched it disappear behind the trees. His legacy, his prison, his punishment, his loss. The town was barely stirring as he drove through Willow Creek. A few early risers saw his truck and turned away, their judgment clear even in silence. Daniel Langford, once the golden son of the heartland, was now nothing but a cautionary tale, a whispered warning to children about the cost of lies. At the town limit, he pulled over one last time and looked back at the place that had made him and unmade him in equal measure. Then he drove on, into an uncertain future, leaving behind the wreckage of everything he'd destroyed. Emily Langford gave birth to a daughter on a crisp November morning, surrounded by her sister, her mother, and a community that had claimed both mother and child as their own. She named her Grace, a gift of mercy she didn't have to earn. The ranch thrived under Emily's management. With the help of a few good men she hired, older, trustworthy, married, she kept the operation running smoothly. She proved to be more capable than anyone had expected, more resilient than even she had known. On quiet evenings, she sat in the nursery rocking Grace, looking out at the land that was now fully hers. And sometimes, only sometimes, she let herself remember the man she'd thought she'd married. Not the man in the barn, but the one before. The one who'd courted her with wild flowers and promises. The one who'd danced with her at their wedding like they were the only two people in the world. That man, she understood now, had never fully existed. He'd been a performance, a desperate attempt to be what everyone expected. And in the end, the lie had consumed them both. She didn't hate Daniel anymore. Hate required too much energy, and she had a daughter to raise, a ranch to run, a life to rebuild, but she didn't forgive him either. Forgiveness, she believed, was something he'd have to find for himself. In a small apartment 300 miles away, Daniel Langford worked construction by day and attended therapy by night. He'd told his therapist everything: the affair, the lies, the lifetime of pretending to be something he wasn't. "I don't know how to be honest," he'd confessed in one session. "I don't even know who I am without the ranch, without the reputation, without the role I was supposed to play." "Then maybe," his therapist had suggested gently, "it's time to find out." It was slow, painful work, unlearning a lifetime of performance, accepting that he'd destroyed something beautiful because he'd been too cowardly to face his own truth earlier, before making promises to a woman who deserved better. He didn't contact Emily. The court order forbade it, but more than that, he knew she deserved her peace, deserved to build her life without him haunting the edges of it. He sent child support payments on time every month, each check a silent apology, a small attempt at responsibility in the wreckage of his irresponsibility. And sometimes, late at night, he looked at the single photo he'd kept, Emily on their wedding day, radiant and hopeful and believing in him completely. He'd failed her, failed their daughter, failed the version of himself he'd tried so hard to be. But failure, he was learning, was not the end of the story. It was just the most painful chapter, the one where everything you thought you knew about yourself burns to ash, and you're left to sift through the ruins for anything worth rebuilding. Whether he'd find it, only time would tell. But for now, in his small apartment far from the heartland, Daniel Langford was learning to live with the truth of what he'd done, and the even harder truth of what he was. And 300 miles away, Emily Langford held her daughter close and looked toward a future that was entirely her own, built not on the broken promises of a golden sun, but on the hard-won strength of a woman who had survived betrayal and emerged unbroken. The town of Willow Creek would talk about the scandal for years, the cautionary tale of Daniel Langford who had it all and threw it away. Parents would use his story to teach their children about the cost of dishonesty. Preachers would reference him in sermons about the dangers of hidden sin. His name would become synonymous with betrayal, with the fall from grace, with the destruction that comes when you live a lie too long. But Emily and Grace? Their names would be spoken with respect, with admiration, with the kind of reverence reserved for survivors. And in the end, that was the truest measure of who had won and who had lost. Not in the moment of betrayal, but in everything that came after. The ranch stood strong under Emily's capable hands. Grace grew in the love of a mother who had learned to be whole on her own. And Daniel Langford faded into memory, a ghost story, a warning, a name that would forever mean regret. The heartland, after all, never forgot. But it did move on. And life, as it always does, continued. In the barn where it all fell apart, dust still dances in the afternoon light. But the sin has been scrubbed from the wood, replaced by the sound of Grace's laughter as Emily teaches her to feed the horses.